I'm James McMichael, and I am the founder and managing partner of Mosaic Responsible Supplier Resource. And today we're going to be doing a condensed recording of a webinar we gave on June 17th to discuss risk-based social auditing, and specifically our new Salient Risk Supplier Assessment offering. So a little bit about Mosaic. Mosaic, if you're not familiar, is a boutique firm made up of consultants that come from a variety of different service providers and brands over the years, with a lot of experience on all types of social auditing and responsible sourcing programs across a variety of different industries. We also have a global network of consultants and staff that visit factories and do work on the ground. Our main service offerings to date have been program advisory, so that's consulting for brands around program design, etc. We also do full program management, so it's end-to-end or fractional. And then we also do on-the-ground factory consulting, as mentioned, and we also do investigations into critical issues. So let's jump right into this. So before we can kind of get into the risk-based auditing, I think it's important for us to kind of step back for a second and do a slight evaluation of the state of current social auditing, which starts with why we started doing it 25, 30 years ago. And that was basically, had one very clear objective, was to evaluate compliance of a brand's suppliers against their full code of conduct. And the key drivers for that were purely reputational protection and public shame mitigation. There were a few lawsuits happened in the early days on the Mariana Islands, but that also did kick off a lot of the code of conduct activity. But for the most part, everything's been based on voluntary and reputational risk protection and pressure from stakeholders like investors, peers, and even employees. And to the point where it grew and grew and grew and grew. I know I was a part of it. I was doing social audit program development and audit program management 25 years ago. And those programs pretty much look the same as today as they did then, except everybody has them. They've become mainstream. But that's all changing, and that's why we're here today to talk about what's changed, what continues to change, and what needs to change within our industry to meet evolving expectations of stakeholders and, most importantly, regulators. So let's first talk about why voluntary social audits to date have fallen short. And we'll just go through these one by one. And this is a very important slide because it's critical to understanding why we have due diligence laws now and why the voluntary social auditing paradigm has sort of fallen short in the eyes of civil society stakeholders and now regulators. So the first is that a typical social audit lacks independence at this point in time. When I first started doing social auditing, probably 90% of all the audits we did were on behalf of a brand that directed us to go visit their suppliers and to evaluate risk there on their behalf in compliance with their code. And that was done in a manner no different than where they were testing lead in a product to make sure it was safe. They wanted to understand and know where the risk was. And so the more risk we could find, the more nonconformities we could find, if you could say it that way, the better we were, better our performance was. There was an incentive for us to find risk where it is. Now, probably 70% of all the audits now are being done through schemes, and they're being done with the audit, the selection of the firm being the decision of the actual auditee, the factory picking the service provider and the auditor that actually comes to evaluate them. So it's moved in a direction of real lack of independence, which is undermine the credibility and the integrity of the entire process. So that's a really, really big one. Next is the announcement model, and something regulators really tune in on, which is if we're looking for real critical issues that are happening in factories, and we're allowing the factories to understand when we're coming, then our ability to find those things is greatly diminished. Pretty simple. The next big one is that social audits were set up to evaluate the entire, all the topics that are covered in a typical code of conduct that were then further scoped out into the minutia of what does it mean to really be in compliance with a particular code element. And so what that's sort of evolved into is a typical auditor is having to evaluate between 200 to up to 500 different standards or questions while on site, plus layering on or layering in whatever local laws might exist as well. So it's a huge undertaking to actually do a really deep analysis of compliance across all these different topics. And when you look at the time that's being allocated for auditors to do these things, it is actually impossible. Auditors themselves have to cut corners, and there's a limited amount of time. And if they don't get it done and don't get the report filled in on time, then they get in trouble. And so this is something they learned over time how to manage and to set priorities themselves. But ultimately, it's basically like overscope with a lot of with a very limited amount of time, and you can guess what that leads to. The other thing is restrictive reporting. Most social audit, all the social auditing schemes for the most part, are also restricting auditors to share their intelligence, share their instincts on what might be happening or clues to what might be happening by only allowing them to report triangulated findings. And triangulated findings means that basically you can prove that something is happening on site through record keeping, through observation, and through verbal interaction with management or workers. So when you look at really nuanced issues like harassment, et cetera, these issues are very difficult to fully triangulate. And so those issues aren't found in audit reports. And really what it comes down to, the brass tacks, is if you look at social audit reports and social audit trends across countries where it is known that salient risks are occurring on a very regular basis by everybody on the ground, and you look at the trends that come across in these schemes and in these programs, the findings aren't there. Like these programs and these social audits are not finding the critical issues, and because of that, there is huge criticism of their efficacy and what they're able to give us. They're not fit for purpose, as one of the exposés calls them. And so what I would call this is sort of well, just before I jump to the conclusion of that, we did a survey even of the auditors themselves. So if we're talking about actual auditors that are doing these, and they themselves admit, right, that nearly half the time there are gaps in what they're able to find based on what is actually happening on site using a regular social audit. They also are very open about what is limiting their ability to find and report critical issues, which is time on site, the announcement aspect of it, and not being given the flexibility to sort of follow their nose and follow their suspicions and change their process and protocol on site when needed, when they believe something's happening, because they're under the gun, under the clock, to actually get the entire audit done in time and with every question filled out. And last, do you feel that critical issues are sometimes found or highly suspected but not reported for some reason? I mean, this is yes, sometimes 40%, no, not very common, 34%, yes, very common, 6%. I mean, this says it all right here, that the auditors themselves openly admit that this is the case. So all this amounts to where we're at, which is basically a crisis of credibility, and now a regulatory response, using a famous Scott Nova quote from him testifying to Congress. Social auditing in practice involves giving unqualified people inadequate time to pursue an unrealistic objective they have no incentive to achieve. Pretty harsh criticism. I would say not entirely fair. I think there's a lot of great work that's come through the social auditing world, and there has been some progress made, in response to the social auditing sort of machine, so to speak. But the fact remains that it's not enough. It's not seen as credible, and to stakeholders in civil society. And now they've had the ear of regulators now for at least 15 years. So if you flash forward now, this has led to these laws, the due diligence laws we're continually hearing about on LinkedIn and on podcasts, and you name it, they're everywhere all the time. So I won't get into the how many and what they all are, but they're everywhere and they're continuing to come, and they're all following a very similar model, which is they're asking us to step back and to take a risk-based approach and to focus on salient critical risks to workers, not risks to brands, but to workers. So they all have a very similar source code. There's differences in reporting and in the countries and the enforcement mechanisms for sure, but they're all going in the same direction. And they're asking companies to create a program narrative that can be shown to identify, prevent, mitigate, and remediate, right, salient risks, critical risks to workers. And it's a rejection of the voluntary, social audit centric world that we've created over the past 25 years. And so I think we're all in a migration towards this model, and this risk-based social auditing is Mosaic's attempt to actually put something out there to our customers and to the broader market that is totally aligned with what regulators are asking for in taking a risk-based approach to your program, and then the tool of social auditing and how that fits in. So what are critical risks? These are primarily, if their critical risks are multiple issues actually. However, the most intense laws are really just focusing on forced labor, migrant labor, abuse related to forced labor, and child labor. So if you were to really strip back a program to get in line with where the most enforcement has already been seen here by U.S. Customs and what's coming down the pike in Europe, you would just be focusing on forced labor, child labor, and migrant labor related to forced labor. However, there are other critical salient risks that also touch into due diligence laws, which include wage theft, harassment and gender-based violence, freedom of association manipulation, and severe health and safety life danger issues. These are all issues that are codified in ILO core conventions. So this is an alignment with the ILO, and these laws are aligned with their language and their topics. And so the programs that we build and how we migrate towards a due diligence model also have to be in step with that. So that's an important point. So let's move on to our Salient Risk Supplier Assessment. So basically what it is an assessment model that is from a risk-based perspective. It's not just about, risk-based program really is about three things. It is who it is that you should be looking at and where, and then also when. So if you're thinking from a social audit perspective, it's not just about when you audit that supplier and which supplier you're auditing. It is also should be how you are auditing them to be effective and targeted at the issues that matter most that you're targeting with your program, which are the salient critical risks. They are not every single topic in your code of conduct. These laws have nothing to do with, say, ergonomics in Mexico. They have nothing to do with, probably 70% of what a social auditor is using with their time on site. And so we are putting forth this proposal to use that same amount of time, but focus it into the areas with on-site protocol that is focused on the things that regulators want to see a focus on. Prioritization. How does it work? So basically, it's a regulatory-driven approach that prioritizes independence and depth over breadth, focusing on known salient risks and applying targeted investigative techniques proven to find nuanced critical issues. These are the issues that everyone on the ground knows are happening, but normal social audits don't find. Okay, so before we get into some of the meat of really what that process looks like, this targeted salient risk supplier assessment model is really going to be, we're thinking of it in three kind of different ways that it could be three deployment models. One of them is basically as an assurance model that sits over all the scheme audits that are being collected and used by so many brands and retailers. There's been a huge movement towards scheme audits that are sort of reducing audit fatigue, as you would say. But they are not improving the actual process, and the outputs and their ability to find the most critical issues are not good. So, however, they are adding value. They are evaluating a certain level of risk. They're evaluating, and they have value to the customers that are using them. So, the idea is that if you're continuing to use those, this can be an assurance model that sits over the top, where you deploy for, say, your top suppliers or in the top critical risk areas, whether it's a country, whether it's Malaysia, for example, or Taiwan, or a country or an issue that's really understood to be high risk. This could be one use model, an assurance program that sits over the top. Another one is that due diligence laws are also asking you to look within your supply chain wherever these risks exist. And in many instances at this point, it's not in the first tier. Remember, we're looking at risk to workers, not risk to brands. Risk to brands has traditionally been seen in the first tier, where the logos are. But risk to workers exists all the way down to the farm level. So this is also a tool we believe will be really effective as an agile tool for looking at sub-tier and subcontracted suppliers, and in a very targeted manner, and onboarding new suppliers as well. Last, I believe that this is also could be a complete replacement for the way a social audit program exists front to back. If somebody wants to if a brand is new to this or wants to really go back to the drawing board with their program and wants to have a totally regulatory driven model, this would be the type of model, something like this, that they should be looking at. So we have 4 core steps that are part of the actual assessment and reporting process. So we're going to go through each of these quickly. First is harvesting data. So we have this beautiful tool that God's given us called AI. Its ability to harvest and pull out and to evaluate risk data against known salient risk in country across different product categories, factory size, and factory type is amazing. So the ability to pull all the information we have about suppliers and the countries in which they operate, analyze them and then to evaluate what should be the focus for the on-site, that is the first part of this and critical to this and what is new. Second is the on-site protocol. So this is where we're trying to take all the things that don't work for a regular social audit and the things that do, and then wrap this up into a new on-site protocol that is focused and in depth, and focusing on, again, those salient risks that have been identified in this risk evaluation process. The on-site protocol and the focus and the terminology is all aligned with ILO language and best practices for ILO better work, and also investigative techniques. It is going to be more worker-centric. It's going to be more remedial orientated, which means that when we do find issues happening, the depth in which the auditors dig to understand why it is happening will be also a priority, so that when you come to the reporting, you have a better understanding of what are the next steps to remediating the issue. This will be independent, right? This is not be a program that is driven by or selected by the auditees themselves. So that's obvious. And again, obviously, country and issue specific. It's not a global cookie cutter program, which is basically what most code and scheme audits are. They are the same questions that auditors are instructed to evaluate in the same way across every country in the world, regardless of the cultural differences and the norms and the laws and the salient risks that exist there. When it comes to reporting, we have some very clear objectives with what we want to do with the reporting. We want it first and foremost to be clear to whoever's reading it what it is. So if it's a regulator that's reading it, we want it to be very clear what it is we did, why we did it, and what was the result in an credible manner. Dependable findings that relate to critical salient risks that are understood and known and identified up front. Again, we talked about the root cause determination, the ability to set up the next steps in this process, which is supporting remediation, which is also part of the due diligence expectation. And then last, giving space for auditors to share what I call risk intelligence, which is things that are happening on site that they weren't able to triangulate and prove, but they believe are a problem, things that coming out of the audit we need to make a decision about additional steps that need to be taken to understand what is happening. A lot of the issues that never get reported is because they are nuanced issues. They're very difficult without enough time and without focused protocol to find and to report on. So we hope to clean up a lot of that with the focus. However, we need to give space and room for giving us intelligence about what's happening, so that we can, make an educated decision about what's going to happen next. And last, and that's not actually part of the SRSA, SRSA process, but it's just the remediation. This is just an example of our remediation program, which has 3 levels. So if the question comes up, like when you start finding a lot more critical risks, what is the next step? How are you ready to sort of remediate these things? That's also something that needs to be thought about. Last, just going to go through a few of the FAQ questions that came in during the webinar and things that have come up as we've developed this in talking to our clients. Just real quickly here. How is the program more important? Again, this will be at the discretion of the brands themselves. The salient risks that are going to be covered, again, are covered by the ILO. Salient risks that I already identified. What does an investigative approach mean exactly? This is basically assessors that are being trained to go beyond checklist verification and a one-size-fits-all process. Our methodology will allow deeper inquiry when red flags emerge through interviews, document review, observations, etc. From a worker-centered evidence gathering standpoint, we will be using survey technology to dig deeper in with workers and giving them a voice in the audit process. And that is part we're kind of piloting, like what's going to work most effectively and efficiently, and can that be done in a consistent manner across countries, or it has to be country specific. Who are Mosaic's assessors? Our existing consulting core around the world, most of them have like many years of auditing experience and then have been trained to do consulting. So our first pass at doing all the pilots for this process will be used with our existing highly experienced consulting team. Like I said, that most of them have 10 or 15, 20 years experience of doing social auditing, so they understand what we're trying to achieve. And working with them on the onsite protocol to make sure that we are giving them the tools and supporting them with what they need to do an effective job at identifying and reporting the issues that we're going after. What standards do we use? We are trying to leverage everything we can, on-site process protocol and terminology from the ILO. So we're basically creating a foundational tool that's based on the ILO Better Work tool, where we're going to expand in terms of the on-site protocol. But we're trying to use terminology and processes that regulators can understand as best practice rather than creating our own. So that's another important point that makes a difference. And then what countries? So these are the countries in which we do our existing consulting work and training. So these are the countries that we're targeting for this SRSA. Some of these countries will be more at the front of the line in terms of the first assessments we're going to be doing. So that's the end of this webinar. If you guys are interested in learning more and getting in touch with us about the pilot and being part of the cohort of brands that are interested in using this model, we would love to hear from you, and I'll be reaching out to a lot of you guys directly about that. We want to have companies that understand the need for this, that have something also to offer, input, and are willing to take this journey with us. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you on the flip side.